Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something very simple. We are going to check into a medieval inn, not the charming timber-framed fairy-lit version from modern films. I mean a real one. Somewhere along a muddy road in 13th century England, or perhaps northern France, where the floor is packed earth, the ale is slightly suspicious, and the smell is layered. And before we go any further, just a gentle reminder, if you enjoy this particular brand of slow, uneventful historical suffering, remember to quietly subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now, let's continue toward mild discomfort. Travel in the Middle Ages was not recreational. No one was finding themselves. If you were on the road, you were probably a merchant, a pilgrim, a messenger, or someone fleeing a problem that would not improve with discussion. Roads were unpredictable, bandits were common, weather was moody, and by the time you reached an inn, you were tired, dirty, and deeply aware that night was the most dangerous part of the day. This is where hospitality rules quietly stepped in and, in many cases, kept you alive. Medieval hospitality was not just politeness. It was structure, it was expectation. It was, in some regions, legally binding. In much of medieval Europe, particularly under Christian influence, offering shelter to travelers was seen as a moral obligation. Scripture had been quite clear about welcoming strangers. You never knew when that stranger might secretly be a saint or an angel, or more realistically, someone with a knife who preferred not to use it if things stayed civil. When you arrived at an inn, the first rule was simple. Declare yourself. You did not slink into a corner. You did not quietly assess the exits like a modern crime documentary enthusiast. You announced who you were, where you were from, and often why you were traveling. This was not oversharing. This was survival. Secrecy made you suspicious. Suspicion made people nervous. Nervous medieval people had weapons. The innkeeper, in turn, had obligations. In many towns, local custom or law required them to provide food, drink, and lodging at a regulated price. Overcharging was technically frowned upon, though enforcement varied depending on how awake the local authorities felt. More importantly, once an innkeeper accepted you as a guest, they were responsible for your safety under their roof. That responsibility was not symbolic. If a guest was robbed or harmed inside the inn, the innkeeper could be held accountable, financially, sometimes legally. This created an incentive system that modern hotels might recognize, though perhaps with fewer torches involved. But protection came with expectations. You, the traveler, were not allowed to behave however you liked. You could not wander into private areas. You did not insult the food. You did not loudly question the hygiene standards, even if they were visibly theoretical. Respecting the household order was essential, because once you disrupted it, you were no longer a protected guest. You were a problem. Another strange but vital rule involved shared sleeping spaces. Private rooms were rare. Most travelers slept in common halls, sometimes several to a bed. Yes, several. This was not considered unusual. It was efficient. Heat was conserved. Space was limited. And if someone attempted something unpleasant in the night, there were witnesses, very close witnesses. There were also customs around weapons. In some regions, guests were required to surrender large weapons upon entry. A sword might be kept behind the bar. This was not an insult. It was an understanding. You came in peace, or you did not come in at all. Breaking hospitality codes was dangerous for both sides. A host who harmed a guest risked community outrage and, occasionally, divine displeasure. A guest who abused hospitality could find themselves expelled into the dark countryside, and the dark countryside was rarely forgiving. Even meals followed unspoken rules. You waited to be served. You did not grab the best portion first. Hierarchy mattered. Seating arrangements reflected status. If you ignored this, you signaled disrespect. And medieval society was built almost entirely on signals of respect. In short, hospitality was a fragile contract, a quiet agreement that allowed strangers to coexist long enough to see morning. And morning, in the Middle Ages, was always a small victory. Morning did not begin with a gentle alarm tone. It began with light creeping through unglazed windows, roosters expressing strong opinions, and someone nearby coughing in a way that suggested they had been alive for quite some time. You would wake stiff, slightly damp from shared body heat and questionable ventilation, and immediately remember that you were still alive, which, under the circumstances, counted as a successful night. But surviving the night was only half the arrangement. Medieval hospitality rules did not end at sunrise. In fact, mornings were when the quiet accounting began. You were expected to pay promptly. Coins were counted carefully, often in front of witnesses. Trust existed, but it was never casual. A traveler who attempted to leave without settling debts did not simply get a poor review. They risked being detained, publicly shamed, or escorted back by individuals with very practical attitudes toward repayment. Yet payment alone did not conclude your responsibilities. Gratitude mattered. You thanked the host. You acknowledged the shelter. Sometimes you offered news from the road in exchange for goodwill. Information was currency. An inn was not just a place to sleep. It was a node in a vast, slow-moving network of rumor, politics, trade updates, and occasional exaggerated dragon sightings. Hospitality also extended beyond inns. In rural areas, travelers often relied on private households. Here, the rules became even more delicate. If a family allowed you into their home, you were temporarily folded into their domestic order. You ate what they ate. You slept where they indicated. You did not comment on the livestock wandering slightly too close to the door. Most importantly, you did not disrupt family hierarchy. A guest who insulted a patriarch, ignored household customs, or flirted inappropriately was not just rude. They were destabilizing the structure that kept everyone fed and safe. In many regions, particularly influenced by older Germanic or Celtic traditions, the concept of guest right was sacred. Once bread and salt were shared, a symbolic bond formed. Harm done after that exchange was seen as a grave betrayal. The idea was simple. Once someone had eaten at your table, violence between host and guest was forbidden. This rule appears noble, and it often was. But it was also strategic. Medieval communities were tightly interwoven. Reputation traveled faster than horses. If you became known as someone who violated guest right, doors would close permanently. Interestingly, the protection went both ways. A guest was not permitted to take advantage of this protection. Theft from a host was considered especially vile. You had been fed, you had been warmed, you had been temporarily protected from wolves, thieves, and the philosophical weight of existence. Stealing after that was more than a crime. It was an attack on social order, and social order in the Middle Ages was everything. Even monasteries followed structured hospitality systems. Monastic guest houses often received pilgrims and travelers, but under strict guidelines. Silence might be required. Participation in prayer was sometimes expected. Meals were simple. You did not treat a monastery like a roadside tavern because monks had a low tolerance for rowdiness and a high tolerance for discipline. Yet for all these rules, hospitality could not eliminate danger entirely. Travelers still disappeared. Inns were sometimes complicit in theft. There are records of corrupt innkeepers collaborating with bandits. The road was never fully safe. But the existence of shared rules dramatically reduced chaos. They created predictability in a world that otherwise offered very little of it. And predictability is deeply comforting. When you stepped into an inn, you entered a known framework. Declare yourself. Surrender large weapons. Pay fairly. Respect hierarchy. Share space. Express gratitude. Leave peacefully. It sounds restrictive. It was. But those restrictions functioned like invisible guardrails along a cliffside road. You did not notice them much, unless you went over the edge. So when we imagine medieval travel as constant peril and dramatic sword fights, we miss the quieter truth. Survival often depended less on combat skills and more on understanding social choreography, knowing when to speak, when to sit, when to hand over your sword without argument. In many cases, politeness was the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming a cautionary tale told softly over ale. And that is a surprisingly calm thought to end the morning with. By the time you stepped back onto the road, having survived a night indoors, you carried more than your pack. You carried reputation. Medieval travel was slow, but gossip was efficient. If you had behaved well, paid fairly, and left without incident, word might travel ahead of you in the subtle ways. He's decent. She pays on time. They don't cause trouble. These were powerful endorsements in a world without identification documents or online booking confirmations. Because, in truth, you did not have proof of who you were. There were no passports in the modern sense. Letters of introduction existed, especially for merchants or clergy, but many travelers had nothing but their word. This made the ritual of introduction at each stop even more important. When you declared your name and origin, you were effectively building a temporary identity in front of witnesses. If someone later claimed you had stolen something or caused harm, the innkeeper and fellow guests could confirm or deny your story. Witness culture was central to medieval hospitality. Most agreements were verbal, but rarely private. Business was conducted within earshot of others. It was not paranoia. It was practicality. Shared knowledge prevented disputes from escalating into violence, or at least reduced the frequency. You might also notice something else inside these inns. Seating arrangements were rarely random. Status arranged the room. Wealthier travelers, local officials, or clergy often sat closer to the hearth. The fire was not just warmth, it was visibility. It was priority. Sitting near it signaled importance. If you were an ordinary traveler, you likely accepted a seat further from the center. Challenging this arrangement would not end well. Medieval society functioned on visible hierarchy. Even if everyone was equally damp and equally tired, equality stopped at the door. Food distribution followed similar logic. Better cuts of meat went to higher status guests. Ale quality could subtly vary. No one pretended this was unfair. It was simply understood. The quiet genius of medieval hospitality was that it allowed hierarchy to exist without constant confrontation, so long as everyone played their part. And most people did, because they understood the alternative. Hospitality rules were not designed to create comfort. They were designed to prevent escalation. A crowded room of armed, exhausted strangers could become volatile very quickly. But ritual calmed that volatility. Clear expectations replaced guesswork. Even lighting had its place in this choreography. Inns were dim, lit by candles or hearth fires. This limited visibility in some ways, but it also softened confrontation. Faces were partially obscured. Expressions were less readable. In a strange way, this reduced the chance of offense. You could not easily misinterpret a glance if you could barely see it. There were also curfews in many towns. Once the gates closed, they closed. Late arrivals might be denied entry entirely. Inside the walls, movement after dark could be restricted. Inns became small islands of controlled interaction within a larger environment that shut down at sunset. And if conflict did arise inside an inn, there were expectations about resolution. Disputes were often taken outside. Physical altercations inside the shared sleeping space were deeply frowned upon. Damaging the host's property risked collective punishment. Other guests might intervene, not out of heroism, but out of self-interest. A broken table meant less stability for everyone. Interestingly, certain travelers enjoyed automatic hospitality protections. Clergy, for example, were frequently granted lodging based on religious duty. Pilgrims, identifiable by badges or simple clothing, often benefited from charitable expectations. Even messengers traveling on official business could invoke authority as a shield, but shields only worked if they were recognized, which meant presentation mattered. Clothing signaled identity. A pilgrim's staff, a merchant's goods, a monk's robe. These were social passwords. Without them, you were simply a stranger. And strangers required careful evaluation. It is tempting to imagine medieval hospitality as purely moral or purely fearful. In reality, it was deeply practical. Communities depended on trade, information, and movement. If travelers were consistently harmed, roads would empty, markets would shrink, isolation would grow. Hospitality, then, was infrastructure. Not glamorous infrastructure, not marble pillars or grand bridges, but a network of shared customs that made movement possible. And movement, even slow and muddy movement, connected the medieval world together. So when we look back at these strange rules, declaring yourself, surrendering weapons, accepting hierarchy, sharing beds with strangers, they might feel uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. But in their time, they were stabilizing, predictable, quietly life-saving, which, if you think about it, is exactly what good manners are supposed to be. There is also something slightly humbling about the fact that your survival on the road depended less on strength and more on restraint. You did not survive medieval travel by being the loudest person in the room. You survived by understanding when not to speak, when not to reach for your cup first, when not to rest your hand too confidently near the sword you had politely surrendered. Because, make no mistake, surrendering that sword was symbolic. It was a gesture that said, "For tonight, I accept your rules. I trust your walls. I agree not to turn this shared space into a battlefield." And in return, the host accepted a risk. Hospitality in the Middle Ages was dangerous for hosts as well. Opening your door to strangers meant inviting unknown histories into your home. A traveler might carry disease, debt collectors, feuds, or simply terrible stories that refused to end. Yet refusing hospitality outright could damage reputation. especially in smaller communities where generosity was remembered for generations. So hosts relied on structure. One curious detail recorded in various medieval town laws is that innkeepers were sometimes required to keep a watch through the night. Either they themselves stayed alert or a servant did. This was not customer service. It was preventative strategy. A watchful presence discouraged theft among guests and reassured those trying to sleep lightly in unfamiliar darkness. Locks, as we understand them, were limited. Security came from proximity and shared awareness. If you attempted something suspicious, you were rarely alone enough to succeed quietly. And then there was the matter of fire. The hearth was the heart of the inn, but it was also a constant hazard. Many towns enforced rules about extinguishing or reducing flames at certain hours. An uncontrolled fire could erase an entire street by morning. Guests were expected not to tamper with the hearth, not to carry open flames carelessly into sleeping areas. In some regions, even candle placement had informal guidelines. It sounds restrictive. It was. But again, these were guardrails against disaster. Even animals followed hospitality expectations. Horses were stabled separately, often for a fee. You did not bring livestock into sleeping quarters unless circumstances were extreme. And if you were granted stable space, you respected it. A poorly treated horse could injure others or damage property. And damaged property meant fines or expulsion. Expulsion was not a minor inconvenience. To be cast out at night beyond town walls was to re-enter uncertainty. Darkness in the medieval countryside was not poetic. It was thick, disorienting, and acoustically active. Sounds carried strangely. Shapes were unclear. Roads were less roads and more suggestions of direction. So when hospitality rules felt tedious, when you waited your turn, moderated your tone, and swallowed minor irritations, you were doing something very practical. You were investing in continued shelter. There were also seasonal variations in hospitality. Winter intensified everything. Roads grew treacherous. Daylight shrank. Inns filled quickly. In some regions, turning away travelers during severe weather was considered morally reprehensible. In others, space limitations forced difficult decisions. And those decisions were remembered. Medieval communities had long memories. A host known for cruelty during harsh winters might find themselves unsupported during their own crisis. Reciprocity was slow, but it was persistent. Hospitality was also entangled with honor. In many cultures, particularly in parts of the British Isles and Scandinavia, offering protection to a guest elevated a household standing. It demonstrated stability, strength, confidence. Only a secure home could afford to be generous. At the same time, guests were expected to leave when appropriate. Overstaying was frowned upon. Hospitality was shelter, not adoption. Lingering too long blurred boundaries and strained resources. There is something very human in all of this. The medieval world was dangerous, yes, but it was also deeply aware that survival required cooperation among strangers. The rules may seem odd to us. Shared beds, surrendered swords, ritualized greetings, but they represent an attempt to civilize uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. So perhaps the strangest thing about medieval hospitality is not how rigid it was. It is how fragile it must have felt. Each night, a room full of unrelated individuals agreed temporarily not to harm one another. They ate together, slept within arm's reach, trusted walls made of timber and stone. And in the morning, if all went well, they parted quietly. No applause, no dramatic music, just another small, ordinary victory over the dark. If you stayed long enough in one of these inns, you would begin to notice that hospitality was not warmth. It was choreography. Every movement had a rhythm. Doors opened at predictable hours. Meals appeared at predictable times. Candles were trimmed with predictable caution. Even conversation followed invisible lanes. You did not interrupt a higher status guest mid-story. You did not loudly contradict someone who clearly outranked you in land ownership or facial hair density, because medieval hospitality was not trying to create equality. It was trying to prevent friction, and friction in a world full of steel objects was dangerous. Consider the act of drinking ale together. It seems simple, but shared drink carried meaning. Cups might be passed, but not casually. In some regions, refusing a drink could be interpreted as distrust. Accepting it meant participating in a temporary social bond. You were signaling that for this evening you were not an enemy, but you also did not drink recklessly. Intoxication loosened tongues. Loose tongues loosened tempers. A guest who became disorderly risked removal, and removal meant the road again, possibly with a slight headache and fewer coins. There were also unspoken dress expectations. You did not undress fully in a shared hall. You maintained modesty, even among strangers. This was not prudishness so much as practical boundary setting. Too much vulnerability invited complication. Interestingly, some towns required inns to display signs or symbols indicating their legitimacy. This reduced the chance of travelers wandering into private homes by mistake, or worse, criminal establishments masquerading as safe havens. Official inns existed within a network of regulation, not perfect regulation, but enough to create a thin layer of trust. Trust, in medieval terms, was rarely emotional. It was structural. You trusted the inn because it had a reputation, because others had stayed and survived, because the host's livelihood depended on maintaining order. It was not friendship. It was mutual dependency, and dependency created restraint. One particularly strange custom in parts of medieval Europe involved communal blessing before sleep. A short prayer, a moment of shared quiet. Even those less devout often participated, not necessarily out of belief, but out of alignment. Refusing might create tension. Participating cost very little. This is the subtle brilliance of medieval hospitality. It encouraged visible participation in peace. Even the architecture reinforced this. Long halls with central hearths kept everyone within sightline. Privacy was limited, and limited privacy discouraged mischief. You could not easily sneak through a corridor unseen if the corridor was essentially the room itself. There were, of course, darker stories, tales of travelers poisoned, of conspiracies between thieves and corrupt hosts. Medieval court records contained such cases, but they stand out precisely because they violated expectation. They shocked communities. They triggered reaction, which means the system, flawed as it was, functioned often enough to be relied upon. It is also worth remembering that many hosts were former travelers themselves. They understood the road. They understood what it meant to approach a lit doorway with hesitation. Hospitality was, in part, a memory of personal vulnerability. So when you picture a medieval inn tonight, imagine less chaos and more quiet negotiation. A stranger enters. They declare themselves. Weapons are set aside. Coins are counted. Bread is shared. Beds are assigned. Rules are followed. No one is entirely comfortable, but everyone is invested in mourning, and that perhaps is the most calming thought of all. In a world without streetlights, without police patrols, without digital locks or emergency numbers, strangers developed a system that allowed them to sleep within arm's reach of one another and wake up, not because they trusted blindly, but because they understood the rules, and quietly, faithfully, they kept them. If you linger just a little longer in that hall, you begin to understand something else. Medieval hospitality was not about kindness. It was about containment, containment of fear, containment of ego, containment of sudden, regrettable decisions made after the third cup of ale. The road produced tension. Travelers carried anxiety the way they carried coin, close to the body and never entirely relaxed. When they stepped inside an inn, that tension did not disappear. It had to be managed. Rules were how it was managed. Take conversation, for example. You were expected to offer news from the road, but selectively. You did not spread panic. You did not loudly announce that bandits were camped 3 miles away unless you had evidence and a reason. Rumor could destabilize a town, and destabilized towns became less hospitable. Information, then, had etiquette. There were also expectations about neutrality. Inns often served as informal meeting grounds for people of differing loyalties, merchants from rival towns, soldiers traveling under fragile truces, even messengers from opposing political factions. Within the walls of the inn, conflict was suspended, not resolved. Suspended. The host's authority overrode external disputes. If 2 men feuding over land found themselves under the same roof, they were expected to behave, at least until morning. Violating this expectation could lead to collective retaliation from other guests who had no interest in being collateral damage in someone else's disagreement. Hospitality created temporary peace zones, and temporary peace zones were revolutionary in their own quiet way. Another strange rule involved light and sound at night. Once people settled, excessive noise was discouraged. You did not pace. You did not rehearse speeches. You did not sharpen blades in the corner. The darkness required calm. Disturbing it suggested threat. Sleep in a communal hall was a shared achievement. Everyone had to cooperate to make it possible. Even snoring, while common and deeply human, could earn mild commentary. There were also expectations around illness. If you were visibly sick, some hosts might refuse entry, not from cruelty, but from survival instinct. Disease traveled efficiently along trade routes. An innkeeper who allowed a feverish traveler into a packed hall risked infecting half the town. Yet in other cases, religious or moral obligation compelled care. Especially during pilgrimages, the tension between compassion and caution was constant. And then there was departure etiquette. You did not leave abruptly before dawn unless necessary. Sudden exits raised suspicion. You waited for the gate to open. You gathered your belongings visibly. You acknowledged the host. Quiet transparency reduced doubt. Doubt, left unchecked, turned into accusation. And accusation in a medieval setting had very sharp edges. There is something deeply structured about all of this. It was not warmth that kept travelers alive. It was predictability. Predictability allowed strangers to estimate risk. If you knew the rules, you could anticipate behavior. If you could anticipate behavior, you could relax just enough to sleep. And sleep was not a luxury. It was survival. A traveler deprived of rest made poor decisions. Poor decisions led to wrong turns, misplaced trust, and occasionally fatal miscalculations. The inn was a pause button in a dangerous world, a controlled environment where for one night chaos was held at bay by shared agreement. It was not perfect. It was not always fair. It certainly was not comfortable by modern standards, but it worked, which is why, across centuries and across regions, some version of hospitality code persisted. From the stone inns of England to roadside khans further east, from monastic guest houses to private farmsteads, the pattern repeats: declare yourself, accept the rules, respect the space, leave in peace. No dramatic speeches, no heroic duels in candlelight, just ordinary people navigating uncertainty through structure. And perhaps that is the most soothing part of all. Even in a world of mud, swords, wolves, and long winter nights, people found a way to build small islands of order, not grand castles, just a warm hall, a shared loaf of bread, a surrendered sword, and an agreement to wake up together in the morning. And if you think about it long enough, the inn itself begins to feel less like a building and more like a fragile experiment. Each evening, it gathered together individuals who might otherwise never meet. A wool merchant from one town, a pilgrim headed toward a distant shrine, a courier carrying sealed letters he did not read, a farmer escorting a mule that clearly regretted its life choices. None of them knew each other. None of them were guaranteed to like each other, and yet they agreed to coexist. Medieval hospitality depended on one quiet assumption, that most people preferred order over chaos, not because they were saints, but because chaos was exhausting. You can imagine the moment just before sleep, the hall dim, the hearth reduced to embers, someone shifting under a shared blanket, someone else muttering a final prayer, weapons out of reach, boots lined against the wall, the door barred from within. That barred door mattered. Locking the inn at night symbolized collective trust. Once closed, no one entered without notice. Those inside were temporarily a unit. If trouble came from outside, thieves, rowdy outsiders, wandering soldiers, it would be faced together. Hospitality created not just safety, but solidarity. Of course, solidarity had limits. If a guest revealed themselves to be dangerous, caught stealing, threatening others, or violating sacred customs, the protection could dissolve quickly. Expulsion was swift, sometimes physical. The same group that had shared bread with you might escort you firmly back into darkness, because the code protected those who respected it. There were also curious regional variations. In parts of medieval Ireland and Scotland, breaching hospitality was considered a grave dishonor, one that could stain a family's name for generations. In parts of continental Europe, town laws specified the exact obligations of hosts toward strangers, including fixed prices and standards of lodging. Even in Scandinavia, older Norse traditions emphasized guest rights so strongly that harming a welcomed guest could provoke feud-level retaliation. The pattern repeats. Hospitality was sacred not because people were endlessly kind, but because the alternative, constant suspicion, would have fractured trade and travel entirely. Movement was necessary. Goods needed to move. Messages needed to move. Pilgrims needed to move. Armies, unfortunately, also needed to move. Without hospitality frameworks, the road would become a chain of closed doors. So the medieval world made a practical decision: create rules that turned strangers into temporary community members. Temporary is the key word. No one expected lifelong bonds. In fact, the beauty of the system was its impermanence. You arrived, you participated, you left. The bond dissolved politely at sunrise. There was no pressure to maintain correspondence, just mutual acknowledgement that for one night you depended on one another. If you compare this to modern travel, with private rooms, key cards, surveillance cameras, and silent check-ins, you might notice something different. Today, safety is outsourced to technology. Back then, safety was outsourced to shared ritual. You survived because everyone understood the script, and scripts are calming. They tell you what to say, where to stand, when to sleep, when to leave. In a world where storms could flood roads overnight and rumors could ignite conflict without warning, having at least one predictable setting, the inn was profoundly stabilizing. So perhaps medieval hospitality feels strange to us. Because we are used to anonymity, they were not. They survived by being seen, by declaring themselves, by participating in a structure that was bigger than their personal comfort. And every morning, when the door unbarred and pale light returned to the road, each traveler carried that quiet success forward. Another night passed without bloodshed, another agreement honored, another ordinary triumph over uncertainty. And in the Middle Ages, that was more than enough. There is also something almost mathematical about medieval hospitality. Inputs: one stranger, one host, limited resources, uncertain intentions. Desired output: no one dies before breakfast. The system did not rely on optimism. It relied on repetition. The more often the ritual succeeded, the stronger it became. Every uneventful night reinforced the idea that the code worked. And in time, it became instinct. You bowed your head when introduced. You accepted your assigned space without negotiation. You kept your voice measured. You placed your boots neatly by the wall. Small gestures, but they signaled alignment. Alignment meant predictability, and predictability lowered the temperature of the room. Even body language mattered. Sudden movements were avoided. Staring too long could be interpreted as challenge. Laughing too loudly at the wrong moment might feel like mockery. Medieval hospitality required emotional moderation. It was, in many ways, a masterclass in controlled behavior. There is a quiet irony here. The Middle Ages are often imagined as loud, violent, impulsive. And yes, violence existed. But inside an inn, survival demanded the opposite: calm, restraint, observation. You assessed the room gently. You noted who appeared influential. You identified who might cause trouble, and then you adjusted yourself accordingly, not out of cowardice, out of intelligence. The host performed similar calculations. They evaluated your clothing, your speech, your posture. They decided whether you were trustworthy enough to admit, whether your coin looked genuine, whether your story made sense. This mutual evaluation was not paranoia, it was negotiation. Hospitality was a contract formed in real time, and like all contracts, it depended on clarity. Interestingly, medieval hospitality also intersected with law in subtle ways. Some regions held hosts financially responsible if a guest's goods were stolen inside the inn. This incentivized oversight. It also meant that guests were expected to declare valuables upon arrival. Transparency reduced dispute later. If you hid your wealth and it disappeared, sympathy might be limited. Everything returned to visibility. Declare who you are. Declare what you carry. Declare your purpose. Secrecy disrupted equilibrium. Even storytelling around the hearth followed structure. Travelers shared accounts of distant markets, political shifts, strange weather patterns. But exaggeration was risky. If proven false later, credibility vanished, and credibility was portable currency. The inn functioned as an early information exchange, not glamorous, not always accurate, but functional. It is also worth considering how physically close everyone was. Proximity creates awareness. You could hear breathing, feel movement, smell damp wool and wood smoke. Privacy was minimal, and yet people managed because they understood the alternative, isolation in the dark. There is something deeply human in choosing imperfect company over solitary danger. So when we imagine medieval hospitality as rigid or strange, perhaps we are simply observing an early version of what all societies eventually create: systems to manage the unknown. Airports have security rituals. Courts have procedural rituals. Even modern dinner parties have rituals, though slightly fewer surrendered swords. The medieval inn was no different. It was a controlled environment where strangers practiced civility for mutual gain. No one expected lifelong trust, just temporary peace. And perhaps that is why, despite disease, war, and winter, the roads of medieval Europe never fully emptied. Because somewhere ahead there would be a doorway, a hearth, a host with measured caution, and a set of strange, steady rules that, if followed carefully, would carry you safely into morning once again. And perhaps the most remarkable part of medieval hospitality is how ordinary it was. No one gathered around the hearth announcing, "Observe how civilized we are being." No one applauded the successful completion of another non-violent evening. It was simply expected. You arrived, you complied, you slept, you left. The lack of drama was the achievement. We tend to remember history through its extremes: battles, betrayals, plagues. But for every dramatic event recorded in ink, there were thousands of quiet nights where strangers behaved predictably and nothing exploded. Hospitality is invisible precisely because it works. Imagine the subtle relief of hearing the indoor barred from the inside, the heavy wood sliding into place, the outside world, its wind, its distant barking dogs, its uncertain footsteps, kept beyond reach. Inside, rules created stillness. No one would draw a blade without consequence. No one would insult a host without losing protection. No one would disturb the hearth casually. Even children, if present, were hushed earlier than usual. There was an understanding that night magnified risk, so the room collectively lowered its volume. Even hierarchy softened slightly after dark. Yes, seating and food had reflected status. But once blankets were shared and embers dimmed, everyone lay horizontally. Titles mattered less in sleep. There is something quietly democratic about horizontal vulnerability. A merchant and a farmhand might breathe the same smoky air. A pilgrim and a minor noble might snore within arm's reach. For a few hours, survival eclipsed social distinction, not erased, just temporarily blurred. Hospitality also functioned as memory preservation. Stories exchanged at inns carried news across regions, but they also carried norms. If a particular town was known for harsh treatment of guests, that reputation traveled. If another town was praised for fairness, travelers returned. Reputation regulated behavior long before centralized enforcement could, and so the system sustained itself. Even during periods of unrest, civil conflict, shifting borders, economic strain, the hospitality code often persisted at local levels. Communities recognized that even when politics fractured, daily life required continuity. A traveler still needed bread, a host still needed income, and both needed mourning. It is easy to underestimate how much discipline this required. Self-restraint is not instinctive under stress, yet medieval society cultivated it, at least within these defined spaces. Children would have grown up observing the pattern, watching parents greet strangers cautiously but respectfully, seeing weapons set aside, hearing the formal exchange of names and origins. These rituals became cultural muscle memory. You did not question them. You inherited them, and inheritance is powerful. By the time you lay down on that rough pallet of straw, surrounded by unfamiliar shapes in the dim hall, you were participating in something older than yourself. An agreement stretching back generations, not a treaty written in parchment, but a custom written in repetition. Follow the rules. Respect the host. Do not break the peace. Leave at sunrise. It was simple, it was fragile, and it was enough. In a time when survival was uncertain, hospitality offered a controlled pause in the chaos, a structured intermission between dangers, not glamorous, not particularly comfortable, but deeply effective. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, the idea of offering shelter to a stranger still feels instinctively right. Because somewhere in our collective memory, we remember what it was like to need that door to open. And in the end, that door opening may be the quiet image that lingers, a wooden door, heavy, slightly warped by weather, opening inward to firelight and the low murmur of strangers who are, for the next few hours, not your enemies. Medieval hospitality was not sentimental. It did not promise lifelong friendship or moral purity. It promised something far more practical, conditional safety. You behaved, the host behaved, the room behaved, and together you postponed disaster. There is something profoundly calming about that arrangement. No grand ideals, no sweeping declarations of universal brotherhood, just a mutual understanding that chaos benefits no one tonight. When you imagine lying there, half awake in the smoky dark, you might realize how much trust was required. Not blind trust, structured trust. You trusted the host because their livelihood depended on maintaining order. You trusted fellow guests because they too preferred a peaceful morning. You trusted the ritual because it had worked before, and so you slept. Perhaps lightly, perhaps with one ear attuned to unfamiliar breathing. But you slept. Outside, the world remained unpredictable. Roads washed out, borders shifted, armies marched, wolves howled without concern for etiquette. Inside, the rules held. Declare yourself, respect the hierarchy, share the space, cause no harm, leave in peace. It was a modest system. But modest systems often endure. The strangeness of medieval hospitality fades when you recognize its purpose. It was never about comfort. It was about continuity, keeping trade moving, keeping pilgrims walking, keeping news flowing, keeping small communities from retreating entirely into suspicion. Without hospitality, travel would have slowed to a crawl. Without travel, economies would have withered. Without exchange, isolation would have deepened fear. So beneath the rough straw mattresses and shared blankets, beneath the surrendered swords and carefully counted coins, lay something unexpectedly sophisticated, a social technology, an agreement that strangers could coexist long enough to see sunrise. And sunrise, in the Middle Ages, was not guaranteed, which makes each ordinary morning departure feel quietly triumphant. Boots pulled on, cloaks adjusted, coins settled, a brief nod to the host. The door unbarred, cool air returning to the lungs. You step back onto the road, not because it is safe, but because it is necessary. And somewhere ahead, another inn waits, another hearth, another set of rules that seem slightly strange and entirely essential. So, when we think of medieval travel as endless peril, perhaps we should also remember the softer truth. Most nights were not battles. Most nights were negotiations. Careful, restrained, repetitive negotiations that allowed humanity to move through uncertainty without destroying itself. And that, for something as simple as a shared roof and a loaf of bread, is quietly extraordinary. Now, if you find that thought a little soothing, you may let it settle. The road is long, the door is open, and the rules, strange as they seem, are there to help you wake up tomorrow. And if you imagine continuing down that road long enough, you begin to notice something subtle. Hospitality did not eliminate danger. It redistributed it. The risk of the forest was exchanged for the risk of proximity. The risk of bandits was exchanged for the risk of misunderstanding. But proximity, unlike wilderness, could be negotiated. Negotiation is quieter than combat. Inside the inn, survival depended on reading small signals. Who holds eye contact too long? Who laughs at the wrong moment? Who seems too eager to know how much coin you carry? You observed without staring. You listened without appearing to listen. Medieval hospitality sharpened social awareness. Children growing up in these environments would have learned quickly that tone mattered, posture mattered, timing mattered. A careless remark about someone's hometown could ripple outward. A misjudged joke could become a challenge. So most people did what humans tend to do when survival is involved. They moderated themselves. This moderation was not joyless. Laughter existed. Songs were sung. Stories were told. But even merriment had boundaries. You could feel when the room wanted calm. You could sense when the host's patience thinned. And you adjusted. Adjustment is the quiet art of coexistence. Another interesting feature of medieval hospitality is how it blurred public and private life. The innkeeper's home was often attached to the inn itself. Family members moved through shared spaces. Children might witness negotiations between armed strangers. Domestic life and public interaction overlapped constantly. This overlap required even more discipline. A guest who behaved recklessly was not just offending a business. They were threatening a household, and households were defensive. At the same time, guests became temporary participants in that domestic rhythm. You smelled the evening stew prepared for both family and strangers. You heard conversations behind half-closed doors. You became aware that you were inside someone else's life. Hospitality demanded sensitivity to that fact. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to assume medieval people were hardened to discomfort. But discomfort does not equal indifference. They valued stability deeply because instability was costly, which is why hospitality codes endured even during crises. During famines or outbreaks of illness, doors might close more quickly. But the expectation remained that under normal conditions, shelter would be offered. This expectation created a psychological map of the road. Travelers knew that between major towns there would be points of rest, points where behavior could reset, where vigilance could lower slightly. That slight lowering of vigilance was essential. No one can remain fully alert indefinitely. Hospitality provided controlled vulnerability. You could remove your boots, loosen your cloak, set aside your weapon, admit fatigue. These small acts signaled that for tonight you were part of something contained, and containment allowed recovery. There is something profoundly human about building systems not to eliminate fear, but to manage it collectively. Medieval hospitality did not promise safety forever. It promised safety until morning, and morning was enough, because with morning came movement, and with movement came possibility. So perhaps the strangest rule of all was this: strangers, who had every reason to distrust one another, repeatedly chose structure over suspicion. Not perfectly, not without failure, but often enough to keep the roads alive. And that repetition, quiet, uneventful, almost boring repetition, was the real engine of medieval travel. Not bravery, not heroics, just adherence to a code that said, very plainly, behave and you may stay. Stay and you may sleep. Sleep and you may continue. And sometimes, in history, that is as close to peace as anyone ever gets. If you keep walking with this thought long enough, you begin to realize that medieval hospitality was less about generosity and more about predictability layered over uncertainty. And predictability is soothing. It meant that even if you did not know the road ahead, you knew the script once you crossed a threshold. You knew that someone would ask your name. You knew you would be assigned a place. You knew that coins would change hands. You knew that, barring disruption, the door would be barred and the fire reduced. The script reduced imagination, and imagination, especially at night, can be unhelpful. The medieval mind was not free from fear, far from it. Superstition, rumor, and spiritual anxiety colored everyday life. But hospitality rules grounded fear in procedure. They transformed abstract danger into manageable behavior. Do not insult the host. Do not conceal weapons. Do not disturb the hearth. Do not violate shared sleep. Follow these, and the unknown outside becomes slightly less overwhelming. Even the architecture of inns reflected this desire for containment. Thick beams, low ceilings, heavy doors, small windows. These were not merely aesthetic choices. They communicated solidity, enclosure, resistance. You stepped inside and felt, at least briefly, that the world had edges again. There is also something interesting about the emotional tone of these spaces. Hospitality did not require affection. It required civility. Civility is quieter than kindness. You did not need to like your fellow guests. You did not need to trust them completely. You needed to participate in the ritual without disruption. And ritual, repeated enough times, becomes comforting. The host repeated the same gestures every evening. Greet, assess, accept or refuse, serve, supervise, close, open again at dawn. Guests repeated theirs. Declare, pay, eat, sleep, leave. Repetition builds rhythm, and rhythm stabilizes communities. Even in times of war, this rhythm could persist locally. Armies might march nearby. Political allegiances might shift. But inside an inn for a few hours, the rhythm held, not because it was heroic, because it was necessary. Without it, travel would shrink, trade would contract, news would stagnate, and isolation breeds suspicion far more efficiently than proximity ever could. So hospitality became a quiet investment in connectivity. You could argue that medieval Europe was stitched together not only by roads and rivers, but by hearths and shared halls, by strangers who tolerated one another long enough to pass through. And tolerance, though rarely celebrated, is powerful. Imagine how many nights passed without incident, how many travelers arrived tense and left rested, how many hosts counted coins by candlelight, satisfied that another evening had concluded without broken furniture or spilled blood. History rarely records those nights, but they were the majority. And perhaps that is the most soothing realization of all. The Middle Ages were not a continuous storm of violence. They were long stretches of careful behavior interrupted occasionally by chaos. Hospitality was one of the systems that stretched those careful periods longer. So when we picture a medieval inn, we might imagine discomfort, smoke, crowded palates, snoring. But beneath all that was something surprisingly stable, a shared decision, repeated nightly, that strangers would behave long enough to see morning. And in a world of uncertainty, that decision, quiet, structured, almost boring, kept the roads alive. And if we slow down even further, almost to the pace of a flickering candle, we can see that medieval hospitality was not merely about shelter. It was about reducing the number of unknowns in a life already full of them. The medieval world was saturated with uncertainty. Harvests failed. Illness arrived without explanation. Lords changed. Borders shifted. Weather ignored human plans entirely. You could not control most of it. But inside an inn for one evening, you could control behavior. You knew how to enter. You knew how to sit. You knew when to speak. You knew when to sleep. That kind of structured predictability is psychologically powerful. Even if the bed was rough and the air smoky, there was comfort in knowing the expectations. And expectations are a form of shelter. It is interesting to consider how deeply embedded these customs became. A child raised in a village with regular travelers passing through would internalize the script early. They would watch their parents greet strangers with cautious formality. They would see weapons collected and returned. They would learn that the hearth was sacred space. These were not abstract lessons. They were survival tools. Hospitality codes also functioned as quiet education in restraint. You learned that not every thought needed to be voiced, that not every suspicion required confrontation, that peace sometimes depended on patience. This restraint did not eliminate tension. It redirected it into formality. Formality can feel stiff, but stiffness prevents collapse. Even humor operated within bounds. Jokes about distant towns were safer than jokes about present company. Stories that gently entertained were preferable to stories that provoked. The room instinctively calibrated itself toward calm. There is a remarkable social intelligence in that calibration. No central authority stood in the hall each night enforcing every nuance. Much of it was self-regulated. Guests understood the stakes. Hosts understood the risks. Mutual awareness replaced constant policing. And because everyone had likely been a traveler at some point or expected to be one eventually, the empathy was practical. Today, you host. Tomorrow, you might knock on someone else's door. That awareness softened rigidity just enough to make the system sustainable. Another subtle element of medieval hospitality was time limitation. You were welcome, but not indefinitely. The understanding that departure was expected prevented the bond from becoming burdensome. Temporary community is easier to maintain than permanent obligation. So each night was a contained episode, a beginning at dusk, an ending at dawn. In between, a careful dance. It is easy to romanticize this as communal harmony. It was not always harmonious. People argued, disagreements flared, but the code provided tools to de-escalate. You lowered your voice. You invoked the host's authority. You postponed the argument until daylight. Postponement alone prevented countless escalations. Sometimes, survival is simply choosing not to continue the conflict tonight. If you consider how many strangers passed through medieval inns across centuries, merchants, monks, soldiers, messengers, widows, craftsmen, the number of peaceful nights vastly outweighs the recorded incidents of violence, which means the rules worked, not perfectly, but reliably enough. And reliability in an unstable world is deeply reassuring. So, when we reflect on the strange medieval rules of hospitality, the declarations, the surrendered weapons, the shared sleeping halls, they begin to feel less strange and more like early social engineering. Simple, repetitive, practical engineering, designed not to create comfort, but to reduce catastrophe. And often, reducing catastrophe is the quietest form of success history ever produces. And if you let that idea settle for a moment, you might notice something else. Medieval hospitality was not built on optimism about human nature. It was built on cautious realism. People understood that strangers could be dangerous. They also understood that strangers could be necessary. Trade required them. News required them. Pilgrimage required them. Even armies, unwelcome as they often were, required lodging. So instead of pretending danger did not exist, medieval communities constructed boundaries around it. Boundaries are calmer than denial. You did not assume the traveler was virtuous. You required them to demonstrate alignment with the code. You did not assume the host was benevolent. You relied on their reputation and the town's expectations. Hospitality was conditional trust, renewed nightly. There is something almost contractual about the exchange. The guest offered coin, information, and compliance. The host offered shelter, food, and protection. Both offered restraint, and restraint was the rarest resource. Consider how often frustration must have simmered. A long journey, poor weather, exhaustion, hunger, a crowded hall with unfamiliar smells and uneven floors. It would not take much to spark irritation, yet irritation was suppressed because the cost of escalation was too high. In that sense, medieval hospitality was a discipline in delayed reaction. You did not respond to every slight. You allowed small inconveniences to pass. You preserved the greater goal, waking up alive. There is wisdom in that hierarchy of priorities. Even the act of barring the door at night carried symbolic weight. It marked the transition from exposure to enclosure, from unpredictability to rule-bound space. Inside the barred door, everyone shared responsibility for maintaining order. If one guest threatened that order, others had incentive to intervene, not heroically, but pragmatically. Chaos was contagious, so was calm. Interestingly, this code extended beyond inns into broader cultural narratives. Stories, songs, and legal traditions reinforced the sacredness of guest right. Violating hospitality was framed not merely as rude, but as morally catastrophic. Why such intensity? Because without hospitality, the social fabric thinned dangerously. A world where every door stayed closed would be a world of isolation. And isolation breeds suspicion faster than any rumor. So medieval society chose the harder path. Open doors, but structured behavior. It required effort. It required patience. It required humility. And humility, in a time of rigid hierarchies, was not always abundant. Yet within the inn, humility was practical. You accepted your place. You accepted the host's authority. You accepted temporary limitation, and in exchange, you received something profound, a night of relative safety. Perhaps what makes these rules feel strange to us is that we often equate freedom with comfort. The medieval traveler knew that freedom without structure could be fatal. So they accepted structure willingly, not because it was pleasant, because it worked. And so, night after night, across centuries of political change and shifting borders, these quiet agreements continued. A stranger knocks, a host hesitates, names are exchanged, coins are counted, weapons are set aside, the door closes, and for a few hours the world narrows to firelight and steady breathing, which in uncertain times is more than enough. And if we follow this pattern all the way to its quiet conclusion, we begin to see that medieval hospitality was not simply a rule book. It was a survival habit. Habits are powerful because they reduce thinking. When you are exhausted from travel, cold from rain, or anxious from rumors on the road, you do not want to invent new social rules each evening. You want familiarity, a sequence you can step into without improvisation. Hospitality provided that sequence. You approach the door, you knock or call out. You state your name and origin. You accept the host's decision. You comply with the house order. The predictability of that sequence eased the mental burden of constant vigilance. And mental relief is a form of rest. Rest in the Middle Ages was not indulgence. It was strategic recovery. A rested traveler walked straighter, judged distances better, negotiated more calmly. A rested host assessed risk more clearly. A rested community functioned more smoothly. Hospitality created micro-restorations across the landscape. There is also something profoundly human about the shared fire. Across cultures and centuries, firelight gathers people. It reduces the vastness of the night into a manageable circle. Medieval inns were structured around that circle. Outside the glow, darkness pressed in. Inside, faces softened. You could see enough to read intention, but not enough to scrutinize imperfection. Firelight forgave details. It encouraged moderation, and moderation is the foundation of peace. It is worth remembering that many medieval people would never travel far from home. For them, hosting strangers was their primary interaction with the wider world. The inn became a window outward. Travelers brought stories of distant cities, strange customs, shifting alliances. Hosts absorbed this information, filtered it, and passed it along. Hospitality was not just shelter, it was communication infrastructure. And infrastructure, even humble infrastructure, shapes civilizations. Without these nightly exchanges, regional isolation would deepen. Mistrust would grow unchecked. Trade routes would thin. So the strange rules, the surrendering of weapons, the shared beds, the formal greetings, were not quaint eccentricities. They were maintenance rituals for connectivity. Maintenance is rarely glamorous. No one writes epic poems about peaceful nights in roadside inns. No tapestries depict the dramatic moment when everyone simply behaves. But that quiet compliance is what allowed more dramatic chapters of history to unfold at all. Because without stable roads and safe rest points, armies could not march, merchants could not trade, pilgrims could not travel, and news could not spread. The medieval world, for all its turbulence, depended on these modest islands of order. So when we imagine lying in that crowded hall one final time, boots at the edge of the pallet, cloak pulled close, listening to unfamiliar breathing in the dimness, we might notice something almost comforting. The room is imperfect, the air is smoky, the straw itches. But the rules are holding. No one has reached for a hidden blade. No one has raised their voice beyond necessity. The door is barred. The hearth is low. And slowly, carefully, you drift into sleep, not because the world is safe, but because the people in this room have agreed to make it safe enough, which, in the Middle Ages, was the closest thing to certainty anyone could reasonably expect. And perhaps the final quiet truth about medieval hospitality is this. It worked not because people were exceptionally good, but because they were consistently practical. Practicality has a calming quality to it. You did not need to believe that every stranger was virtuous. You only needed to believe that most strangers preferred not to escalate a situation that could end badly for everyone involved. The inn was a shared calculation. If I behave, I sleep. If you behave, you sleep. If we both behave, we all wake up. It was not poetry, it was arithmetic. There is something almost soothing in that simplicity. The medieval traveler did not expect comfort. They expected structure. Structure was enough to allow muscles to unclench slightly, enough to remove boots, enough to close eyes for a few hours without gripping a weapon. That slight unclenching is what the rules purchased. Even the ritual of returning weapons in the morning symbolized continuity. The sword you surrendered the night before was handed back. The agreement was temporary, but honored. The contract concluded without incident. Small reliability builds large trust, and large trust allows networks to expand. Over centuries, these repeated, uneventful exchanges accumulated. They allowed trade routes to thicken. They allowed pilgrimage routes to become predictable corridors. They allowed towns to grow in confidence that strangers would not automatically bring ruin. All of this from something as humble as shared bread and a barred door. It is easy to think of medieval society as fragmented and unstable, and in many ways it was. But within that instability, people constructed microsystems of order wherever they could. Hospitality was one of those systems, a modest one, a smoky, straw-filled, occasionally uncomfortable one, but resilient. If you trace enough historical records, town laws, monastic guidelines, merchant accounts, you find recurring references to lodging, guest right, fair pricing, expectations of conduct. They appear again and again like a refrain, which suggests something important. The system was not accidental. It was deliberate repetition, and repetition is how fragile agreements become tradition. Tradition, once established, feels natural. It feels obvious. It feels almost invisible. Medieval people likely did not think of themselves as participating in an intricate social survival mechanism. They were simply doing what is done. But what is done is often what keeps society from dissolving. So, as we slowly let this image fade, the inn quiet, embers dim, breathing steady, it becomes clear that the strange medieval rules of hospitality were not strange at all. They were an early understanding of something very human. Strangers can coexist if given structure. Structure reduces fear. Reduced fear allows rest, and rest allows continuation. The road stretches onward. The night returns again and again. But each evening, somewhere along that road, a door opens, a name is exchanged, and the rules begin their gentle work once more. And that quiet work, repeated thousands of times across centuries, is what kept travelers alive. And if we let the embers fade just a little further, we can see that medieval hospitality was, in a quiet way, an agreement about vulnerability. Everyone inside that hall was vulnerable. The host was vulnerable to theft, to violence, to disease, to reputation damage. The guest was vulnerable to expulsion, to accusation, to the cold road outside. Even the town was vulnerable, its stability resting on how it treated those who passed through. Hospitality did not erase vulnerability. It organized it. When vulnerability is organized, it becomes less chaotic. It becomes something shared rather than something faced alone. Inside the inn, you were no longer a solitary traveler against the night. You were part of a temporary arrangement, not permanent, not sentimental, but structured. And structure distributes risk. If something went wrong, it was no longer you against the dark. It was the room against the disruption. The host's authority, the presence of witnesses, the weight of reputation, all formed a quiet shield. This shield was not impenetrable, but it was enough. It is also worth noticing how deeply patience underpinned the entire system. Medieval travel was slow. News traveled slowly. Resolution of disputes was slow. Even justice moved at an unhurried pace. Hospitality mirrored that slowness. You did not rush entry. You did not rush departure. You did not rush judgment. Slowness reduced mistakes. When you slow down, you observe more. You escalate less. You allow space for misunderstanding to dissolve rather than ignite. There is something almost meditative about that. In the dim hall, with firelight flickering across rough beams, time itself seemed to stretch. The urgency of the road softened. The world narrowed to manageable proportions, and in that narrowing, tempers cooled. The medieval inn was not a sanctuary from reality. It was a carefully moderated version of reality, a space where human unpredictability was cushioned by routine. Even the simplest acts, passing a loaf of bread, refilling a cup, adjusting a blanket shared between strangers, reinforced the message, tonight we cooperate. Cooperation does not require affection. It requires alignment. And alignment, repeated nightly, became cultural expectation. Generations grew up within this expectation. They learned that doors could open without disaster, that strangers could share space without bloodshed, that peace, however temporary, was achievable through discipline. This learning accumulated, and over time, it shaped how medieval society functioned beyond the inn. Because once you understand that strangers can coexist under rules, you can build markets. You can build fairs. You can build towns that welcome outsiders without collapsing under suspicion. Hospitality, then, was not a peripheral custom. It was foundational, a quiet cornerstone of movement, exchange, and continuity. So as the night deepens once more in our imagination, and the hall settles into steady breathing, perhaps the most remarkable thing is not the strangeness of the rules. It is their restraint. No dramatic declarations, no elaborate ceremonies, just repeated, disciplined behavior. Strangers entering, strangers staying, strangers leaving unharmed. And sometimes, in the long history of humanity, that kind of ordinary success is the greatest achievement of all. And as the centuries moved forward, the ritual barely changed. Empires shifted, kings rose and fell, borders redrew themselves in ink and blood. But along the roads, the same small exchange continued. A knock, a pause, a question, a name. It is almost quiet enough to miss in the grand narrative of history. Yet without that exchange, the grand narrative would fracture. Imagine if every door had remained closed, if every host had chosen suspicion over structure. Travel would shrink to desperation. Trade would become rare. Information would stagnate. Fear would grow heavier with each isolated winter. Instead, communities accepted the discomfort of regulated openness. They did not throw doors wide without caution. They did not embrace strangers blindly. They applied rules. Rules create boundaries. Boundaries create calm. Calm allows continuation. There is a subtle brilliance in that logic. Hospitality was a social compromise between fear and necessity. Too much fear, and society fragments. Too little caution, and chaos spreads. The inn balanced those forces nightly, and balance, especially in uncertain times, is deeply stabilizing. Even when tension simmered, when rumors of war drifted in with travelers, when harvests failed and resources thinned, the ritual often held. Perhaps voices were quieter, portions smaller, doors barred earlier, but the script remained recognizable. Because abandoning the script would mean surrendering predictability entirely. Predictability is a rare comfort in unstable eras. It is easy to imagine medieval people as constantly on edge. And yes, vigilance was part of daily life. But hospitality provided a scheduled lowering of that vigilance, a structured pause. Not safety without condition, safety with condition. If you align yourself to the expectations of the room aligns itself to your survival. That alignment required humility. You accepted that you were not in control of the space. You respected that the host governed the hall. You acknowledged that your presence depended on cooperation. Humility, in this context, was not weakness. It was strategic adaptation, and adaptation is how societies endure. The medieval inn was not luxurious. It was not especially clean. It was not always peaceful, but it was governed. Governance, even at the smallest scale, prevents collapse. So when the embers dimmed and the last quiet conversation dissolved into breathing and occasional shifting straw, what lingered was not just warmth. It was agreement, an agreement that strangers would restrain themselves for mutual benefit, that they would not allow ego, suspicion, or fatigue to erupt into violence, that for one more night the road would not claim another victim, and as morning crept in again, soft, pale, unremarkable, boots were laced, cloaks were fastened, and the agreement dissolved without ceremony. You stepped back onto uncertainty, but slightly restored. And somewhere ahead, another hall waited, ready to repeat the same quiet miracle. Which is perhaps why medieval hospitality, strange as it may seem, was one of the most quietly effective survival technologies ever built. Not iron, not stone, just rules, faithfully followed. And if we follow this quiet thread all the way to its gentlest conclusion, we arrive at something almost understated. Medieval hospitality endured because it accepted imperfection. The rooms were crowded, the straw was uneven, the air was thick with smoke and breath, the conversations were cautious. It was not ideal, but it was functional, and functionality in uncertain times is more valuable than comfort. Hospitality did not aim to eliminate fear. It aimed to make fear manageable, to contain it within walls and rituals, to transform a room full of armed strangers into a temporary collective with shared incentives. Shared incentives are powerful. If one person disrupted the peace, everyone suffered. If everyone upheld the code, everyone benefited. The math was clear enough that most people chose cooperation over confrontation, not because they were morally superior, because they were tired, and tired people prefer sleep to conflict. That may be one of the most realistic foundations of medieval peace. Exhaustion can be stabilizing. You had walked miles through mud. You had crossed uncertain territory. You had bartered, negotiated, perhaps endured cold rain. By the time you reached the inn, you did not want drama. You wanted warmth. So you complied with the rules. You spoke carefully. You ate what was offered. You lay down without argument, and in doing so, you contributed to a fragile but effective system. There is something deeply human about that choice. Across cultures and centuries, people have repeatedly chosen structured coexistence over chaotic isolation. The medieval inn is simply one visible example of that pattern. It reminds us that civilization is not always built through grand architecture or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it is built through repeated restraint in small, smoky rooms. Restraint at the table. Restraint at the hearth. Restraint in the dark. And restraint creates space for morning. When the first light filtered through narrow windows and the host unbarred the heavy door, it was not just wood moving against wood. It was the completion of another successful negotiation. No theft, no bloodshed, no collapse of order, just quiet departure. Perhaps the greatest success of medieval hospitality is that it left so little dramatic evidence. It worked so consistently that it faded into the background of daily life, and background stability is easy to overlook. Yet without it, nothing else functions. So the next time we imagine the Middle Ages as a place of constant peril, we might also imagine a dim hall filled with steady breathing, a loaf of bread shared without incident, a sword resting harmlessly behind the bar, and a group of strangers who, for one uneventful night, agreed not to harm one another, which in any century is quietly extraordinary. And so, at the very edge of this long road, we arrive somewhere unexpectedly calm, not at a castle, not at a battlefield, not at a dramatic turning point in history, but at a wooden door closing gently against the night. The strange medieval rules of hospitality did not create comfort in the modern sense. They did not promise privacy, luxury, or perfect safety. What they offered was something far more practical. They offered enough structure to reduce panic, enough predictability to lower suspicion, enough shared expectation to prevent escalation. That was the achievement. In a world without centralized policing, without standardized travel documents, without reliable lighting or communication, communities constructed a behavioral framework that allowed strangers to move through their territory without constant violence. It was not flawless, it was not universal, but it was repeated often enough to become dependable. And dependability is what keeps roads alive. Every time a traveler declared their name and origin, they were participating in a long-standing ritual of transparency. Every time a host collected weapons and returned them at dawn, they reinforced a contract of temporary peace. Every time guests shared a hall without drawing steel in the dark, they strengthened an unspoken network stretching across towns and centuries. This network was not made of stone or iron. It was made of behavior. Behavior, repeated calmly, becomes culture. Culture, when stable, becomes survival. If you imagine one final night inside that inn, you might notice that nothing extraordinary happens. The fire dims. Someone shifts in their sleep. A beam creaks softly. Outside, the wind moves across fields and hedgerows without concern for human arrangements. Inside, the arrangement holds. Strangers lie close but restrained. The door remains barred. The hearth remains controlled. No one reaches for violence. No one breaks the code. And when morning arrives, as it almost always does, the door opens again. Boots touch earth. Cloaks are adjusted. Names fade into distance. The inn remains, ready to repeat the ritual with the next uncertain traveler. That is the quiet power of medieval hospitality. It did not eliminate danger. It simply reduced it, night after night, through discipline and shared understanding. And sometimes in history, survival is not about dramatic victories. It is about small, repeated acts of restraint that allow people to wake up again. So, as this story settles and the embers finally cool, perhaps the most soothing thought is this: across centuries of instability, ordinary people found a way to make strangers sleep under the same roof and see another sunrise, not through heroics, not through idealism, but through rules, strange, steady, and quietly life-saving rules.